The world of music stands frozen in grief and disbelief as Ozzy Osbourne, who was 76, takes his final bow. On July 22, 2025, the Prince of Darkness passed away after a long and grueling battle with Parkinson's disease and years of devastating health setbacks. One of his most haunting confessions now echoes like a prophecy fulfilled. "The past 4 years have been sheer hell for me. My health has been in a terrible state." This wasn't just a rock legend. This was a man who had stared into the abyss again and kept walking. A man whose every breath was defiance in the face of pain. Parkinson's disease didn't just weaken him. It stole the power from his legs. A horrific fall shattered his spine, leaving him gasping through surgeries and silence. And now, as the world mourns, it's clear that fate has delivered its final and most vicious strike. Behind the shadow of the Prince of Darkness lay a soul gasping for peace. A warrior worn down by endless war. What happened to Ozzy Osbourne is not just another chapter in a tragic life. It's a revelation so painful, so heart-wrenching, it will leave you shaken long after the final note fades. Before we dive in, hit like as a simple gesture of respect for a legend who gave the world everything he had and now leaves behind a silence more powerful than any scream. Before the roaring crowds, before the blazing lights, before the legend of the Prince of Darkness was etched into music history, there was only silence. A silence so heavy it threatened to crush the soul of a boy who didn't grow up to dream. He grew up to survive. In the stained slums of Aston, Birmingham, a young John Michael Osbourne, born in 1948, lived in a cramped, cold home with 6 children and 2 parents who were too exhausted to nurture. His father, worn thin by factory labor, believed emotion was weakness. His mother, hardened by endless hours on the assembly line, rarely had the energy to offer softness. Ozzy, as the world would later know him, was not the clever one, not the charming one. He was the overlooked one, the child who blended into the wallpaper of poverty. At school, he found no refuge. The letters taunted him. Numbers blurred and danced. Dyslexia wasn't understood in the 1950s. It was mistaken for stupidity. Teachers dismissed him as hopeless, and classmates mocked him with cruel delight. The bullying wasn't just names shouted across playgrounds. It was fists in the hallway, knees to the stomach, bloodied lips behind buildings, and no adult ever asked why. At home, there was no escape. Once, after coming home in tears, his father beat him with a belt. Not because he was weak, but because weakness wasn't tolerated. Pain didn't get you sympathy. Ozzy would later recall. It got you punishment. And so the silence around him grew louder. He learned to wear it like armor. But armor doesn't heal. By the time he turned 14 in 1962, that silence had become unbearable. In a tiny, dimly lit bedroom, he tied a rope using his mother's washing line, climbed onto a chair, and waited for the world to let go of him. Fate intervened, not with mercy, but with rage. His father burst in and yanked him down, then beat him again, as though violence could beat out despair. Something in him cracked that day, or maybe something finally calcified. He stopped trying at school, stopped speaking unless required. He drifted through adolescence with the blank stare of someone already halfway gone. The sound of laughter became foreign. The mirror showed a boy already fading. At 15, he dropped out with no qualifications, no purpose, and no plan. He worked where he could, at a slaughterhouse, on construction sites, in factories tuning car horns. But he was too distracted, too awkward, too broken for any of it to last. Each job ended the same: fired, forgotten, alone. By 17, hunger gnawed at him. Not metaphorical, but real physical hunger. His shoes had holes. His shirts hung in threads. And his hope was a crumpled thing he no longer bothered to hold. He was running out of oxygen. Not just in his lungs, but in his life. When desperation hit, it didn't whisper. It screamed. In 1965, a botched burglary landed him in Winston Green Prison. Behind those walls, reality hit like iron. In one terrifying encounter, he was attacked by another inmate. And he fought back the only way he knew how, with a metal chamber pot. It wasn't bravery. It was survival. But even in that darkness, a spark refused to die. One afternoon, the Beatles' She Loves You crackled through a prison radio and something ignited. For the first time, Ozzy didn't want to disappear. He wanted to be seen, to be heard, to live out loud. That moment changed me, he would later say. I didn't know how to play anything, but I knew I needed to be on stage. I needed to scream louder than the pain inside me. That scream became his salvation. Not success, not yet, but a reason to keep going. In that moment, in that prison, the boy who had once begged the world to let him go made a vow. He would not die forgotten in Birmingham. He would be loud. He would be terrifying. He would be unforgettable. And from that decision, a legend began to rise. Not from peace or privilege, but from the ashes of despair, where pain forged a voice that would one day shake the world. The shadows of his troubled youth had barely begun to lift when something extraordinary pierced through the silence of despair. A sound, a calling that would anchor his soul for decades to come. Ozzy Osbourne, newly released from Winston Green Prison in 1965 at just 17, wasn't searching for redemption. He was simply drifting through a world that had already decided he wouldn't matter. His 6-week sentence for robbing a clothing store, a desperate act of survival more than crime, hadn't taught him any lessons, only confirmed his worthlessness in the eyes of society. He walked out of that cell, not reformed, but more fractured than ever. And then a miracle came, not in the form of a savior, but a song. When he heard the Beatles' She Loves You crackle through a cheap radio speaker, it was as if the world cracked open. It was like hearing God speak to me through music. He later remembered, his voice distant, almost tearful. That moment didn't erase the bruises on his back or the fear in his bones, but it gave him a vision. He didn't know how, but he knew he had to make music. Not polished music, not perfect music, but music that screamed. That screamed louder than the pain he had carried for so long, that screamed louder than the silence of his childhood, that screamed louder than the darkness he almost gave into. In a tiny, dimly lit bedroom, he tied a rope using his mother's washing line, climbed onto a chair, and waited for the world to let go of him. And now, just 2 years later, he was hearing a reason not to. By 1968, that scream had found its echo. A modest newspaper ad seeking a vocalist led him to a rundown rehearsal room in Birmingham, where he met 3 other haunted men. Tony Iommi, a guitarist whose missing fingertips couldn't blunt the fury in his riffs. Geezer Butler, a bassist whose fascination with the occult gave their sound its unease. And Bill Ward, a drummer who played like thunder trapped in human skin. They called themselves Earth at first, but a chance encounter with a horror film marquee, Black Sabbath, sparked something more than a name. It became a purpose. If people pay to be scared, Ozzy would later say, why not give them music that terrifies and moves them? They weren't trying to be famous. They were trying to survive, trying to purge something ugly and unspoken. Their songs weren't entertainment. They were exorcisms. They were agonies set to distortion. They were grief turned into guitars. On Friday, February 13, 1970, they released their self-titled debut album. The date alone, dark, ominous, almost cursed, felt like fate. Critics recoiled. They called it satanic, disgusting, unlistenable. But the youth, the broken, the lonely, they listened and they felt seen. In a world where no one asked them how they were doing, Ozzy screamed it for them. That same year, their second album, Paranoid, was written in a rush, almost by accident. Yet it became gospel. War Pigs, Iron Man, and the haunting title track weren't just tracks. They were lifelines. Ozzy's voice wasn't classically trained. It wasn't even properly tuned, but it was real. It was raw. It was the voice of someone who had clawed his way back from the edge and now dared the world to push him again. I didn't know what I was doing, he admitted later. But I knew it had to be loud. That loudness wasn't just volume. It was vengeance. It was a scream that said, I survived and I will not be quiet. He never learned to read music, never took a lesson, but he didn't need to because his pain was the melody. His wounds were the lyrics, his past was the percussion, and his soul, that was the amplifier. Behind the madman persona, behind the wild antics and stage theatrics, there still lived the boy from Aston. The boy who was told he was stupid, worthless, invisible. That boy was still screaming. But now the world was listening. The early years of Black Sabbath weren't just about pioneering a genre. They were about reclaiming life. Ozzy didn't build heavy metal. He bled it into existence. Every concert, every growl, every riff was a rebellion against a fate he was supposed to accept. And even as fame came crashing in, crowds roaring, record selling, headlines blazing, he remained haunted. The louder the applause, the louder the voices inside him screamed. The success never silenced the hurt. It only masked it. And as the world began to call him a legend, he still felt like a runaway screaming into the void. But that scream changed the world. It built more than music. It built myth. It built memory. It built a legacy forged in torment and somehow resilience. By the mid-1970s, Ozzy Osbourne stood on the summit of heavy metal glory. But beneath the roaring crowd and blinding stage lights, his soul was quietly crumbling. The same voice that once pierced the silence of a generation was now being drowned out by inner demons no spotlight could reach.